Good to see everybody this evening. We are in the book of Isaiah, our continued study of this book, and we are tonight going to look at chapters 40 through 48. We're going to deal with this segment, and we've been kind of taking this survey approach towards the book, trying to pause when we can to make sure we grasp certain aspects that we need to see. But some of the material, as we've said before, is very repetitive. And so once we've got the understanding of what Isaiah is trying to convey, we're not necessarily stopping it every time he repeats those same thoughts. And so that's been kind of our approach, and we'll continue to do that through, obviously, it's the last Wednesday of November. We'll have 4 studies, Lord willing, in December that will then wrap up the book of Isaiah. But we are going to slow down a little bit. Next week I'm going to start, of the next section, which is chapters 49 through 53, that's the prophecies concerning Jesus. And so we're going to slow down on those. In fact, I wrote it down in your notes that we're going to spend 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, I'll see. If I need to spend more time on those, I will, just because I think that's an important segment of Isaiah's prophecies that we need to make sure we understand. And so I'll slow down a bit starting next week when we get into those sections. But let's look at this bulk of these 9 chapters from chapters 40 through 48 tonight, and just kind of get an imagery of what the prophet is trying to convey to us from the message that God is providing. He begins this segment by saying, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. And so in the midst of all the challenge, all the difficulty, all the warnings, the judgments, again, there's this repeated theme. God comes back. I can show mercy. I will show mercy. I'll allow a remnant to honor me again. And he goes through all that kind of messaging repeatedly throughout the narrative. And I think God's mercy is a part of His character that seems to always come forward, even in the midst when He's frustrated, angry, His wrath and vengeance is pouring out. That character of mercy never leaves Him. And you and I should be thankful for that. That even when His justice demands certain things, and even when He brings some pretty harsh judgment and challenge to people, that even in the midst of that, we can appreciate that His mercy's still there. That He doesn't just vacate that concept of who His character is. He doesn't just walk away from the idea that He's still a merciful God just because He needs to deal with a particular moment in time, circumstance, or group of people. The mercy hasn't left Him. Notice, though, He mentions something here in verse 3 of chapter 40 when He says, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Who's that sound like? How do we know that's John the Baptist? Because it tells us that, right? When you go into Matthew chapter 3, and you look at Matthew chapter 3 and you begin in verse 1, in those days came John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness of Judea, and saying, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this is he that was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make His paths straight. And so it's one of those very interesting prophecies that we have within the book of Isaiah, that we have a very direct fulfillment of, and specific knowledge of who it was that fulfilled it, because it's directly connected for us. Don't always have that benefit, right? Sometimes you've got to deduce it. Sometimes you might see it, but there's no perfect clarity that says, yes, that's exactly the truth on that. But it is something I think that's important, because that's a time period in which the prophet Isaiah keeps pointing to. And he tells them, here's certain things that you'll know this is coming. And here's another one of those pieces of the puzzle that you'll know this great one, this great prophet, this one that God promised to Zion, that we'll see again before we're done in our study tonight. You'll know He's arrived because there'll be one crying in the wilderness. And then John the Baptist is identified as that one there in Matthew chapter 3. And so you can kind of see these fulfillments and connectivities to the promises. It's interesting that various individuals have asked God for signs. I was asked a question at the end of our study last week that I didn't deal with in the class. I'll give it 30 seconds here tonight. There was a moment earlier in our study where he talked about that moment of degrees when it comes to a sundial. And it's interesting because you can go over into the Kings and you can see in the days of Ahaz. And the Babylonians, by the way, as I understand it, historically, were the creators of the sundial. They are the ones that first began to build and make sundials. And some of you were probably practically there. But anyway, there's a... I'm sorry. I didn't look at anybody in particular when I said that. But there's a moment there where the prophet says, or rather there's a request for a sign, and the request was, I'll prove it to you, Isaiah says to Ahaz, I'll prove it by letting the dial move forward 10 degrees. And he says, well, wait a minute, that could kind of just happen. Once it does, no, if you really want it to be a sign, let that shadow go backwards. Let that go backwards. And now there's been a lot of speculation about, did God move the sun forward in the sky and then move it backwards in the sky to make that happen? God doesn't have to move the sun to make a shadow move on a sundial. The implication seems to me to be that the shadow, because he even says that, you go back into Kings, you'll see that even more clearly in the account there where Isaiah is dealing with Ahaz, where this conversation occurs. But God could easily make a shadow move and forwards, backwards, upside down, whatever he wanted to do. And wouldn't have to move the sun. For that matter, though, he could also move the sun if he chose to. It's his. But I saw more of the idea of, give me a sign. And he says, well, I'll move the shadow 10 degrees. Oh, if you can do that, then no, a real sign would be move it back 10 degrees. That's really harder to do. And that's kind of the scene I think Isaiah is referring to in that earlier chapter in that history. So my answer to that question then was basically, I think God moved the shadow. He didn't have to move the sun to move the shadow. But that's all pointing and telling them signs of things, the great things that are to come, that they needed to be appreciative of. Notice verse 8 of Isaiah chapter 40. He said, grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. They needed to come to an understanding that what God had promised and fulfilled, and when He speaks, it stands. And they continuously were rebellious. They would challenge that notion. They would create difficulties when God would say something they didn't like. They would try to reverse it. And He's trying to convince them at this stage, particularly as He's going to lead them back out of bondage and back into the promised land, that when He speaks, they need to be paying attention. He speaks about the greatness of God and how He is a great shepherd who leads His people. In verse 11, He said, He shall feed His flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with His arm and carry them in His bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. That sounds very similar to whom? Jesus, right? In John chapter 10, Jesus talks about Himself being the good shepherd, and my sheep hear my voice, and they follow me and are led by me. The same kind of imagery here that God's using in relationship to Himself. I'm a great shepherd. I want to lead my people. I don't want to be angry at them forever. I don't want to be upset with them and be this vengeful judgment, rendering God to them forever. I'm looking forward to a time where they listen to me again, and I can come back in greatness and let them be led by me as a shepherd. He reminds them that all the things that exist are all His, who hath measured the waters in the hollow of His hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance. God, in this descriptive way of how detailed He knows the earth in which He created, says you could lift that mountain up and I can tell you exactly how much it weighs. That's how knowledgeable God is. And all of this to me is just simply trying to reassure them, listen, if you'll listen to me, if you'll follow me, if you'll pay attention to what I'm saying, I can do great things for you again. I'm the God who created all things that you know of and are aware of. And here's the thought that keeps coming back throughout these chapters we're looking at tonight. No one is equal with God. He's concerned about what's going to creep back in among the people when they return. Idolatry. All these 9 chapters are really about that. God is great, idols are futile. we could go home in some ways. Good, you stayed. Thank you. But that's really the message of these 9 chapters. If you want the simple, quick, summary version of these 9 chapters, God is great, idols are not. He uses some more colorful language than that we'll see before we're done. And which one are you going to trust? Who are you going to believe? What are you going to rely on? With whom took he counsel? Who's God seek counsel from? No one, right? No one. There's no reason for him to take counsel. Who instructed him? Who taught him in the path of judgment and taught him knowledge and showed to him the way of understanding? Notice, skip down to verse 18. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare unto him? You ever tried to, and I'm horrible at this. I'm an audio learner. I'm not a big visual guy. When I hear things, I tend to pick up on them easier than I do. Maybe that's why I talk a lot. I don't know. But anyway, it's interesting here. If you were to ask something, well, try to compare God to something. Well, visually, you try to, right? You can't do it. If you've ever been asked to describe somebody, trust me, if I witness a crime, don't send me to the sketch artist. It ain't happening, right? It's just not going to happen. I have an inability when it comes to visual things like that. How can you compare God to anything? There's nothing to compare him to. It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. It's interesting. When you hear that verse, what do you normally think of? What's that verse usually used for? Show the earth is round. We know that verse because we want to show the world that the earth was round, and God knew it, and even Isaiah knew it, and if the people of God would have listened, they would have known it, even in the days of Isaiah. But we can get caught up in that and forget that God's got a point here. I don't know that Isaiah is concerned about evolutionary processes that are going to be taught in school systems in America, and you're right, in the 1900s, and so he threw this verse in just so we get it, and we can kind of use. No, he's got a point, and his point is God's sitting on the circle. God's sitting over the circle. Everything that's involved in the earth, right? Maybe he means sphere. That's a fair definition of the word here. But if I said to you, I have a circle of friends, what do I mean by that? A group, right? Or something that I'm connected to. So it doesn't always mean round, is the point I'm making. The word doesn't always mean round, a sphere. It can have other implications. And again, I'm not arguing here. Don't write me letters, and I'm not saying you can't use this verse. He may very well have the idea here of a sphere. And God is sitting and He's showing to us that the earth was a circle. And obviously it is. And we've known that, now. But and we knew that long before many men admitted it. I get all of that. I'm not downplaying that. But just be careful that we don't miss also the point. And the point is, God is trustworthy. The whole earth, I can measure it all, I can weigh it all, I can put it all in the balances, I can control all of it. Nothing is beyond my grasp or abilities. It's like a curtain that spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. When he speaks of these things, he's in control. And that's really the message that Isaiah is trying to get across to the people. Not a science lesson, but a power lesson. That God is in control. And He's worthy of trust and confidence that they place in Him. Right. And I think, and that's his point, right? What can you compare Him to? Nothing. He sits on top of the earth. How can you, who are you going to compare that to, right? That's this messaging, and it's just going to keep going, by the way, over the next several chapters. Sometimes people may feel weak and incapable. It's possible as the people come back, are we really even able to serve God anymore? Can we even get back to what He wants us to be? After all this judgment and all this condemnation that's come down and all the destructiveness that has come, is it even possible? And then notice what he says, verse 27. Why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my judgment is passed over from my God? Why are you concerned about whether you can accomplish the purposes of God? If they're His purposes, they can be accomplished. There's no reason to question this because God empowers the weak to do it. Verse 31, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Wow! Wouldn't that be great? To be able to get down here and just walk and walk and walk and walk. Never get out of breath. Never get tired. Never get an ache or a pain. Never get weary. Not faint. But when you're serving the Lord's purposes, He can renew you day by day and provide strength in spiritual ways that gives us eagle's wings that let us accomplish and fulfill. Because then it's not about what I'm doing, but it's about what God is doing through me. He gives me the wings of an eagle. He allows me to run and not grow weary. He allows me to walk and not faint. Yeah, Jacob, Israel, you may feel like you're unsuitable to fulfill God's purposes moving forward after everything you've been through, including the condemnations that have come at God's hands. But I can empower you through all of that. And renewal is absolutely coming. I'll pause out of chapter 40 for a second. Keep going into chapter 41 because he really hasn't stopped. So, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The place for God, Isaiah is saying, He sitteth on the circle of the earth. In Job, I think it's 22, it states that the clouds veil Him above the earth. Are we noting that this is the place where God is now? I mean, I always had the idea that God is not in the heavens above the earth, but in His heaven.
I did not view it as a location. I viewed it as a power. He sits over, He's in charge of, has authority over. And that's the imagery I get from that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I didn't view that as a place as much as I did His ability to rule over it. So the renewal is coming. And so chapter 41, verse 1, keep silence before me, O islands, and let the people renew their strength. Let them come near, then let them speak. Let us come near together to judgment. He continues to tell them, don't be afraid. But thou art Israel, art my servant. Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend. Doesn't sound like some of the language we've heard before, is it? As He renews them and plans to bring them back and back into covenant relationship with Him, His mercy shines through. You're still the chosen one. You're still the seed of Abraham, my friend. Thou whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, and called thee from the chief men thereof, and said unto thee, Thou art my servant. I have chosen thee, and not cast thee away. Fear thou not, for I am with thee, but be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will keep thee, yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Behold, all they that were incensed against thee shall be ashamed and confounded. They shall be as nothing, and they that strive with thee shall perish. And basically, God is trying to get them to understand that, yes, I brought judgment, but I'm renewing you, and you've got work yet to fulfill. You're still the chosen people. You're still the seed of Abraham, and Who hasn't come yet? The Savior hasn't come yet. The chosen servant, which we'll see here in a minute, hasn't arrived yet. There's still work to be done, Jacob. There's still work to be done, Israel. You're not done yet. And you're still the seed of Abraham who's got lots of covenant promises that still need to be finished. I'm not done. You're going to have to trust me. And so he begins to say the warnings about idolatry. And he says, trust the true provider, because the idols are futile. And he reminds them to let the idol gods come forward and prophesy as God has done. If you really want to trust in them, just have one of them come and tell you something. I've been telling you things over and over and over again, and you've watched all of them come fulfilled, right? I warned you about this nation would come, and they came. I warned you about that nation would come and go, and they came and went. One after another, the prophecies have been fulfilled. He says, call upon one of those idols and let them come. Let them come and give some of these prophecies and see how they end up. Produce your cause, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring them forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things, what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. Yea, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and hold it together. God's saying, nothing compares to me. I sit on the circles of the earth. I can even weigh the mountains. I've prophesied backwards and forwards, told you of things that were and things to come. Show me an idol that's done any of that, he says. Show me one that's done good or evil. Just show me one. Behold, you are of nothing, and your work of naught. An abomination is he that chooseth you. Behold, they are all vanity. Their works are nothing. Their molten images are wind and confusion. Why are you trusting idols when you have the God of all things prepared to let you be His people again? Why would you rely on the futility of any of those things when the great God is available to those who would restore themselves to Him? He's just challenging them. There's work to be done, and you're going to have to trust the true God and not fall back into idolatry when you return back into the land, because none of them have proven themselves worthy of anything. So, he just got done speaking about how Jacob, Israel, is a servant to God, still chosen people who had work left to be done, but he also speaks of an elect servant in chapter 42. He spoke of chapter 41, generic, Jacob, his people. But notice a difference in chapter 42. Behold my servant whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to whom? To the Gentiles. They had purpose to fulfill because we've got to get to this elect servant. We have to arrive at a time period in which Jesus can come. And so, though they had roles to fulfill, there was still one, a perfect servant, who would fulfill exactly the purposes the Lord God desires. It's interesting, right? Because God needs them by His own design and purposes and plan. He needs them to finish the work. But their whole existence in relationship to Him has been flawed. They have not been a perfect servant. They are error-prone, and one minute they're with Him, and the next minute they're serving idolatry, and one minute they're honoring Him, and the next minute they're doing something else. And so they've got this on again, off again. But the elect servant, the chosen servant, would not be such. And look at John 4, verse 34. Jesus saith unto them, my meat is to do the will of Him that sent me, and to finish His work. Israel fulfilled its role to get us to Jesus. But when Jesus arrived, He says, my job when I get here is to do the will of Him who sent me and finish this. These plans and these purposes and these functions that God has purposed to bring salvation, not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles, Jesus came to finish it. And Isaiah is telling us about that elect one that was to come. And it's interesting because he said about this elect chosen one, his methods would be different. Notice verse 2 of chapter 42. He shall not cry nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. Did people hear Jesus teach? Yes, okay. So in what way do you think he means this? He will look and act and sound like everyone else. Okay. And we'll get some of those extra prophecies in chapters 49 through 53 eventually in our studies. But I think really he's not out forcefully pushing forward the purposes that he is asking of people to listen to. It's interesting, right? Now, I'm hesitating because I don't want to overstate this, but in the days of Isaiah, is God being forceful? Oh, yeah. Yeah. He's bringing war. I mean, he's bringing war in order to accomplish the purposes and things. Do you think the noise of the things that God was doing was being heard by men? Oh, yeah, yeah. But when the one I'm sending to you ultimately arrives, he's not going to come in the same fashion. He's not going to come with the sword of war. He's going to come with the sword of truth. He's not going to be in the streets just shouting down and screaming down others to make sure they listen to him. He's just simply going to come and share his message and let men choose. And that's been the purposes and method of Jesus from the beginning. It'd be a lot easier maybe in our minds if we could just force people to do what was right. But Jesus didn't even do that. Jesus didn't come forcing people to honor him. He came not crying, not lifting up, or causing his voice to be heard in the street.
They have the choice.
Well, they still have choice, but he's much more forceful in the manner in which he's dealing with them. And I think that's the contrast. And it's interesting because it's the weak and the needy that are going to listen to that gentle voice. Just notice verse 3. A bruised reed shall he not break. It's interesting because that's hard because he talked about which nation. You may remember who was that Egypt, right? Egypt was that reed. It was just, couldn't really... But this is same imagery, different purpose. He said, those who are a bruised reed, Jesus doesn't come to snap them in half. He comes to help them. The smoking flax shall he not quench. You ever seen that candle and the wick is getting to the point where 1 minute it's burning okay and then it's dim and then and you're wondering, should I just throw this candle away? Do I try to fix this? What do I do? Is it worth anything? That's the imagery here. That reed that seems like it could just snap. Jesus doesn't come to break it. He doesn't come to snuff out that last little ounce of hope and light that you have in your life. He comes to bring judgment and truth. And I think it's exactly, if you just go into who was it that generally received Jesus? The common, poor, the needy, those who were maybe felt like they were that candle just barely flickering in life. Those who didn't feel like they had any hope and any chance of benefit or strength or encouragement. Those bruised reeds that could easily have just been broken And Jesus comes to heal and to help. And that's really the new picture that God's trying to get them to see about this one that's coming. He said they'll sing unto the Lord a new song in verse 10. And His praise from the end of the earth, ye that go down to the sea and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof. Let the wilderness and the cities thereof lift up their voice. The villages that Kedar doth inhabit, let the inhabitants of the rocks sing. Let them shout from the top of the mountains. Let them give glory unto the Lord and declare His praise in the islands. Great things are going to happen. And there's a new song coming to Israel. They had condemnation and judgment at the hands, first the northern tribes at the hands of the Assyrians, and then ultimately Judah at the hands of Babylon, and then they're in exile, and finally you're going to have some rulers that come along that let those people come home, right? And as they do, they're going to sing a new song, a celebratory song. And all that weakness and downtroddenness, and be able to put that behind them. It's interesting, the Revelator spoke of a similar phrase. I think they're not identical. I think they're two different thoughts that express the same kind of thing. But the Revelator wrote in Revelation 15:3, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. They sing in heaven a new song. We sing a phrase like that in one of our hymns. Isaiah says, when they come home, they'll sing a new song to Jehovah for the mercies and the kindnesses and the grace that He's offering to them. Hear ye deaf, and look ye blind, that ye may see. Again, now pointing back to the days of when Jesus will come and allow the deaf and the blind to be able to hear and to see literally. But I think this may have just as much implication for those who would return from exile and captivity, because they once didn't listen, but now could and would, and they once didn't see what God really wanted, and now would as they return back to the promises of God. And despite all the needed judgments and the consequences for their sinful choices, Israel was still the servant of God that would ultimately lead to His perfect servant, Jesus, when He would arrive. You are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am He. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. The Lord alone, He says in verse 11, I am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior. He would be the only one they needed and the only one they should be turning to. And I think He also encourages them to appreciate that they needed to be careful not to become weary in the process and purposes that God was having for them. Notice verse 22 of chapter 43, but thou hast not called upon me, O Jacob, but thou hast been weary of me, O Israel. I want to stop there. I'm going to run out of time, but I want to stop there for just a second, because I think there's a reality that we need to appreciate here. It is possible to grow weary in fulfilling the purposes of God. His chosen people in these days had grown weary of His purposes, and they turned their attentions elsewhere. And I only say that not as excuse, not as some statement that kind of gives us some kind of permission slip, but just to help us recognize that how would I think I would be any different? If they could grow weary, I can grow weary. If they can get discouraged with the process and purposes of God, then I can do the same. Go ahead, Kent.
I think Paul wrote in Galatians where he says, "Don't grow weary in doing good."
Yeah, and I think that For in due season you shall reap if you faint not. There's an importance for us to realize that the marathon that we're in as we head towards heaven it's got its pitfalls and challenges and difficulties. And we've got to be careful that we don't become weary of the purposes of God. And I think that's what He's calling them to recognize. You got weary of it, and you turned to idols because of it. And He's trying to fulfill and bring them back to appreciate those things. I want to get to this phrase because it's really a repeated phrase, and I could scroll through my notes for you very quickly because there's a bunch of these. And I think if I share one with you, you'll get the picture. But he says, there's no God but Jehovah God. In chapter 44, he says it this way, Thus saith the Lord, God, the King of Israel, and His Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, I am the last, and beside me there is no God. And who as I shall call, and shall declare it and set in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people, and the things that are coming, and shall come, let them show unto them. Fear ye not, neither be afraid. Have not I told thee from that time, and have declared it? You are even my witnesses. Is there a God beside me? Yea, there is no God. I know not any. There isn't anybody else. Don't fall futile to those graven images. Notice verse 9 of chapter 44. They that make a graven image are of all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit. They are their own witnesses. They see not nor know that they may be ashamed. They don't know anything. Why? They're idols, right? They're graven fashion. They don't know anything. He gives this interesting description. He says, and this is verses 9 through 20. I'm giving you a summary of it. The blacksmith is hungry, thirsty, and tired. All the while, he's sitting there making a graven image to an idol. His belly's growling. He's thirsty as all get out. He's weak and tired. Where's the God that he's fashioning this idol for? Right? That's the point. Where's the God? The carpenter cuts down a tree. He fixes the house. He makes a fire for warmth. He cooks his dinner, takes the leftover wood, and whittles an idol. Did I say whittles an idol? Whittles an idol. And then he says, will you really bow down to the abomination made from the residue of a hewn tree? That tree was cut down. They used it for carpentry work. They warmed themselves. They cooked their dinner. Then they took the scraps and made an idol. And that's what you're going to bow down to? That's what you're going to trust? That's the colorful imagery he gives them to help them appreciate how futile and vain idolatry is. And none considereth in his heart, neither is there knowledge nor understanding to say, I have burned part of it in the fire. Yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I've roasted flesh and eaten it. And shall I make the residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down to the stalk of a tree? Am I supposed to be bowing down to the trunk that's left over? The residue of what was cut down to do all these other things? He's just trying to show them how silly it is for how men have dedicated themselves to worshiping graven and fashioned and formed images. Even the people making the idols recognize the futility of it. They're hungry and thirsty and worn out while they fashion the image. They take just what's left over after they've cooked their dinner over the fire to then whittle out a small trinket of an idol to then worship. The Lord is the real Redeemer of Israel, and He's the one that they should focus on, and they shouldn't think for a minute that any idol god could provide that kind of renewal. And one last segment. He said in chapter 45, I am the Lord and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west, and there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. And anyone who strives against that Creator is going to fail and lose. And that's really all he says, by the way, the rest of these chapters. It's just a repeated theme. Why listen to an idol when you've got the real Creator who sits on the circles of the earth that you could be listening to? Why bow down to the hewn image when there's a God who wants to be a God over you, and besides Him, there is none else? There's nobody else. So why would your interest or your thought processes be anywhere else? And I think you'll see that that's the theme throughout the rest of that segment.